It's great to be here, and thank you for coming on such a cold, wintry, dark evening. The paper that I'm about to speak to is based on an article in this great publication, Rethinking Democracy, and was written with a wonderful colleague of mine, Des Friedman. So I must say that anything you disagree with, he wrote, and he's in America, so he can't even talk about it. But that's, this is also, there's some great other chapters within this publication that if you are interested in some of the things I've got to talk about, I would recommend that you go there. Well, what I'm going to begin with is talking about this relationship between the media and democracy. You know, we've become used to those two words as being somewhat inseparable. It's like Cagney and Lacey or Starsky and Hutch. You can't have one without the other. And that whole idea that you've got a free exchange of ideas, information, symbols that nourish citizens' understanding, that really replenish a democratic system, has long been seen as one of the central foundations of democratic societies. We need a free media in order for a fully functioning democracy. And we have a whole complex normative paraphernalia that has grown up around that relationship. So we have the whole idea of media as an independent watchdog. I'm sure James Harkin, when he came and spoke to you, mentioned that a lot. It's a monitor of unchecked power, a tribune of the people, a defender of minorities, a fourth estate, and a public sphere. They're very large claims for this relationship between a fully functioning democracy and our media systems. Free media are said to provide the oxygen, the lubrication, the very sinews of a fully functioning and robust democracy. But what do we actually find in those places where that discourse is most heavily rehearsed? We're actually seeing quite the opposite. A media that all too often preys on the vulnerable and bows down before the powerful. Sahel mentioned the work of Hacked Off and said that this was largely about celebrities and other elites and the hacking into their phones. Well, actually, that's not entirely true. There's thousands and thousands and thousands of so-called ordinary people who were also having their phone records checked. And one of the reasons this became such big news was because of the phone hacking of a murdered schoolgirl, Millie Dowler. We have a media whose noble crusade for truth and justice has been replaced largely by a carnival of gossip and spectacle. A media that demonstrates a commitment to consumer rather than popular sovereignty, a media that's no longer an outlier, but actually a constitutive part of class rule. And I'm going to rehearse the arguments that go behind these claims in a moment. A media that has adopted the mantras of the free market rather than the very difficult practices that are involved in ensuring free expression, political participation, and therefore democratic renewal. The result of this disconnect, really, between the actual media system and its claims for democracy have become a huge increase in the loss of authority and legitimacy. In Europe, the only media sector that's actually trusted by the majority of the population now is radio. Bizarrely, we can talk about why that might be later. And in 2017, the Edelman Trust Barometer, who do an annual survey around trust, reported that the media was distrusted in 82% of the 28 countries they surveyed, and it had dropped to an all-time low in 17 of those countries. Traditional media face the steepest decline, and you can see from here that it's not just media that are suffering a decline of trust, but a whole range of other established institutions. So that collapse in trust is far from unique. It's related to the same backlash against entrenched interests that's also eaten into the credibility of neoliberal political parties and politicians. And given that the mainstream media is so entangled with elite power, So they've also been implicated in the same mire of corruption and scandal. So we now know that Rupert Murdoch and Donald Trump are great mates. In fact, Murdoch was in the room when Trump gave his first foreign interview to a UK journalist, here the lovely Michael Gove, who, of course, is a Murdoch reporter, a Murdoch fan, has worked for Murdoch in the past. It's rumoured that Murdoch rings Trump at least once a day, and I have that on fairly good account. The Financial Times reported that Trump's daughter Ivanka was a trustee of the nearly $300 million fortune that Murdoch set aside for the 2 children he had with his third wife, Wendy Deng. Ivanka Trump gave up that oversight role in December before Trump's inauguration, but well after Election Day. So the whole time that Rupert Murdoch's highly influential news organisations were covering Trump's campaign and transition, their executive chairman was involved in a type of arrangement of the very highest personal level. And that, of course, is highly reminiscent of the revelations during the phone hacking scandal in the UK and the Leveson inquiry, when it emerged that Tony Blair, a former Prime Minister of the UK, was godfather to one of the Murdoch's children. So I'm only giving you a brief flavour here of how that entanglement between media elites and political elites functions. The latest news about the Murdoch-Trump axis is acutely problematic for the leadership at the Wall Street Journal, also a Murdoch-owned newspaper, as many of the staff believe the newspaper has held them back from more aggressively covering Donald Trump, they suspect, under pressure from Murdoch. But it's not just the Wall Street Journal. The collapse in trust is part and parcel of the whole veneer of liberal watchdog, which has now been stretched perilously thin across much of the mainstream media, where in fact neoliberal rationality has become the norm. A classic example here is found in the responses to the 2008 financial crash, and much research now has charted how that crash itself was covered. Rather than the crisis spurring the questioning of the logic of global capitalism, we saw its logic extend. Austerity politics became a normalised solution to the crisis, wherein, and this is a quote from Bly, those at the bottom are expected to pay disproportionately for a problem created by those at the top. And when those at the top actively eschew any responsibility for the problem by blaming the state for their mistakes, not only will squeezing the bottom not produce enough revenue to fix things, it'll produce an even more polarised and politicised society in which the conditions for a sustainable politics of dealing with more debt and less growth are undermined. Populism, nationalism, and calls for the return of God and gold in equal doses are what unequal austerity generates. Now that was written several years ago, but I think has been incredibly prescient for the current context. Unemployment, high levels of personal debt, extreme poverty and inequality feature very heavily in this particular post-crash moment. This slide simply shows you the changing, how spending power across the country has lessened, and how, as aligned to that, an increase in the number of food banks and their usage across the UK. This is actually outdated now, it's 2016. If you look at the latest data on use of food banks in the UK, it's increased far more than that. So the impact of that particular crisis, the one we're living through at the moment, has been especially marked for poor and minority communities as well as young people. So not surprisingly, we've seen people's overall confidence in established systems of governance start to crumble. In the UK, and this is work from the Hansard Society, only a third of the public think the system by which Britain is governed works well. Just 35% 41% believe that when people like themselves get involved in politics, they can change the way the country's run. Only 13% feel they have some influence over decision-making nationally, although interestingly, 41% would like to have some influence over decision-making. So it's these sorts of conditions, massive austerity, huge increases in inequality, a complete disconnect from our systems of governance and the role you play in your daily lives, in which a series of political earthquakes have taken place. We've seen the collapse of the main presidential parties in France, the election of Donald Trump, the resurgence of an anti-austerity politics of Jeremy Corbyn, and we can also point to Bernie Sanders in the US, and then the decision taken in 2016 by UK voters to leave the European Union. These events have brought to the fore the economic dislocation that's taken place since the 1980s. They reveal huge class, generational, and ethnic divisions. Marginalised voices have kicked back against a post-war party system that has failed them, and a professional political elite that has largely ignored them. And these were the circumstances in which the media's democratic credentials were tested. So the central issue may not be that we are suddenly surrounded by what is described as fake news, but that we've been living with fake democracy. And I want to kind of switch that round to make an argument that actually the whole discourse around fake news has been something of a distraction. This takes the form of a democratic facade that promises much but delivers little, leaving its citizens confronted by, as Raymond Williams once said, the coexistence of political representation and participation with an economic system that admits no such rights, procedures, and claims. This sham sovereignty is not incidental to, but intertwined with liberal capitalism, of which our mainstream media industries are very much a part. The real problem may not be the Macedonian cottage industry churning out pro-Trump messages, but in equating liberal democracy and a liberal media with meaningful control of our collective lives. Actually existing democracy, rather than its utopian ideal, both in its rhetoric and its political routines, has very successfully used discourses of equality and autonomy to commodify individualism and constrain freedom. And the whole discourse around the internet and social media is part of that. It's riven through with that idea of personal freedom and autonomy. It has promised popular rule and self-governance through market exchanges and constitutional guarantees. But actually what we have instead is a shrink-wrapped democracy that celebrates only the most pallid forms of participation and engagement, with all political nutrients removed. Citizens have been recast as consumers, collective decisions transformed into questions of individual need and choice. And in doing so, it's given us nothing more than the illusion of democratic communications. A media, actually, where editors and top politicians dine at the same tables, are educated at the same institutions, and share many of the same corporate values and ideological agendas. This is a picture of George Osborne, once Chancellor of the Exchequer, who moved seamlessly into being editor of the Evening Standard. So you can just see how that revolving door works. A media that's disaggregated in theory but centralised in practice. A media where the tools may be open source, but the most powerful networks remain closed. This then is a media marked by commerce, complicity and caution, rather than critique, creativity and a journalism of conscience. We're now facing a new democratic fakery in which the elite media institutions, extending right from the BBC through to the New York Times and Google and Facebook, are using the crisis posed by a growth of anti-establishment politics to argue that only they are capable of sustaining a consensual, rational, and credible information ecology that can expose fake news and protect established truths. The problem is, they intend to achieve this by relying on exactly the same personnel, the same evangelical belief in algorithms, the same agendas that fail dismally in their democratic responsibilities and are intimately connected to a neoliberal order that has alienated millions of people. And there's more bad news. Convergent shifts in cultural production, journalism, political communications, marketing and data mining have contributed to the emergence of a mediated regime that's facilitated by deregulated, commodified, affective and even faster forms of what Jody Dean calls communicative capitalism. Here, political discourse is commandeered by the stuff of entertainment, while news all too frequently traffics in trivialities and repackaged public relations material, and occupies an increasingly fragile and narrow centre ground. This determination that's actually traceable across the last 40 years to subjugate all areas of mediated activity to market logic and competition through ever more commercialisation, privatisation, restructuring, has prepared the way for what Will Davis has referred to as post-truth politics, based on an oversupply of facts and an under-provision of meaningful analysis. So here we get what we've referred to in media communications as faster and shallower journalism, less and less detailed critique and analysis, and more clickbait, fast feed, knee-jerk responses. We now have a mainstream journalism that fails to perform what's assumed to be the central role of a media in democracy, its willingness to interrogate the power relations that shape our world. This is partly because of the quick fix, rapid fire, clickbait strategies which don't allow for critical reflections, but also because media organisations themselves are increasingly implicated in power relations that they have very little reason to actually illuminate or change. The problem's compounded by the sheer scale of the largest media organisations. So despite Rupert Murdoch's claim, and this was his claim in relation to the increase in circulation of online news online, he said, no one controls the media or will ever again. Markets in both new and old media sectors are actually heavily concentrated, ever more concentrated, and skewed towards wealth creation, effectively suffocating any notion of the public interest. And if I can, I'm going to link you through to this. That was an animation that we did as part of the Media Reform Coalition, just to try and push out this idea that what we're in fact facing is huge increases in concentration of media ownership, and therefore huge increases in that very elite media power. Media landscapes from the analogue world of the print title to the global digital monopolies of Google and Facebook, and these are some of the biggest monopolies that history has ever seen, are resistant to traditional forms of regulation and out of reach of democratically organised political will formation. The UK has a supposedly competitive national newspaper market, but just 5 companies, largely presided over by tax exiles and media moguls, control 90% of daily circulation. And that, you know, the argument, oh, but that's shrinking ever more. Actually, their agenda leading the power is ever increasing. They help to set the agenda for the rest of the news media. For all the rhetoric around a paradigm shift from traditional to social media that works to the advantage of both the populist left and right, it is not the case that legacy media have lost the ability to influence conversation and conduct. The situation is actually worse when it comes to the increasingly profitable digital world. Facebook is fast becoming the dominant digital platform for news. Meanwhile, Google has some 90% of global desktop search, and Google and Facebook together account for around 2/3 of all digital advertising in the US. According to the Financial Times, 85 cents of every dollar spent on digital advertising in America went to those two companies in the first quarter of 2016. And the predictions for 2017 are that those two companies together will soak up half of the world's global digital advertising spend. That's astonishing level of concentration. Not only do they own the playing field, but they're able to set the rules of the game as well. The bewildering market power wielded by the likes of Google and Facebook doesn't come at the expense of the influence of mainstream press and broadcasters. Google, Facebook, and Twitter are, if anything, reinforcing the agenda-setting power of the mainstream news brands by facilitating their increased circulation through algorithms. The gatekeeping power of Google and Facebook works in tandem with that of the mainstream news providers. They mutually reinforce each other around what they consider to be real, legitimate, and authoritative news. Only in much of the popular press, certainly in the UK, this is a press that's riddled with distortions, misrepresentations, and illegitimate news. The fakery that we are most enthralled by is that the internet is a public good rather than a monetized commodity, that it promotes or is even interested in freedom of expression and civil discourse, that our actions online are activism rather than consumerism. This symbiosis certainly helped pave the way for the election of Donald Trump. After all, it wasn't so much his provocative and offensive tweets that enabled him to capture the headlines that helped him to ascend to that hugely powerful political office, but the way in which mainstream news networks were from the outset fascinated by his personality and aware of his commercial potential. And he plays on this all the time. So the more offensive, provocative, outlandish the comment, the bigger the lie, the more newsworthy it becomes. Twitter gave him a platform, but mainstream news provides the microphone and its amplification, the ability to be heard, that is the major currency of agenda power. So just as much of the elite media were horrified by his politics, they were gripped by his star potential and well aware of the financial benefits that would bring. Given that profit-seeking is, as Victor Pickard puts it, in commercial media's DNA, it was no surprise to hear the CEO of broadcast media giant CBS declare that Trump's candidacy may not be good for America, but it's damn good for CBS. The money's rolling in, and this is fun. This is going to be a very good year for us. Bring it on, Donald. Keep going. Fake news is not new. Popularity, volume, consumption, sales, and entertainment dictate the form and content of the internet, just as they dictate much of the form and content of commercial media. That the commercial media now scream, "Trust us," is at best disingenuous. The New York Times spent millions of dollars on a television commercial during the Super Bowl 2017 entitled "The Truth is Hard." While its commentators argue that independent, fact-based journalism has never been more important, truth has not yet perished, but to deny that it is under siege would be to invite disaster, that may be true, may well be true, but it overlooks certain key things. First, fake news is not an exception to, but the logical extension of a market economy that privileges short-term rewards and commercial impact. The rise of programmatic advertising and the domination of advertising by Google and Facebook are hardly peripheral developments, but part of a structural readjustment of the media. In this situation, fake news, according to researchers at Columbia University, quote, is a distraction from the larger issue that the structure and economics of social platforms incentivize the spread of low-quality content over high-quality material. Journalism with a civic value, journalism that investigates power or reaches underserved and local communities, is discriminated against by a system that favours scale and shareability. Fake news is also itself a disputed category, and I know, I'm sorry that's a bit blurry, but you get the general idea with the dark grey boxes. It refers to hugely different practices, from falsehoods deliberately concocted to undermine democratic processes, such as elections and referenda, through traditional journalism with its long history of misrepresentations, exaggerations, and distortions, including so-called yellow journalism and sensationalist claims such as Saddam Hussein's Iraq being able to launch weapons of mass destruction within 45 minutes, through to what Damien Tambini simply describes as news that challenges orthodox authority. Each of these instances is claimed in different circumstances as fake news, and each requires quite different policy and professional responses. But at the moment, it's only that first kind of deliberate lies designed to disrupt democracy that seems to absorb the attention of mainstream media. Why? Because it's an attempt to construct a narrative that contrasts professional journalism based on ethical responsibility and objectivity with fake news, anything that departs from established protocols, and it's likely to involve the resurrection of the same newsroom agendas and the same authorities of truth-telling and expertise that have failed to make sense of the world for so many people, and that at least in part have paved the way for the rapid rise of fake news that the mainstream media so deplore. The point is that powerful media interests, as with any dominant group whose backs are against the wall, are conducting something of a propaganda campaign themselves, designed to suggest that only they can be trusted with safeguarding freedom of expression and a commitment to truth, and that only they can be guaranteed to preserve democratic rights. Yet while we desperately do need a journalism that is both fearless and rigorous, we have absolutely no reason to believe that the existing professional model is capable of delivering it. The linkage between democracy and the free market is surely broken. If, as Wolfgang Streeck argues, the legitimacy of post-war democracy was based on the premise that states could regulate markets in the public interest to prevent their worst excesses, then massive increases in inequality has surely cast doubt on this, as has the incapacity of governments to either prevent or find sustainable economic alternatives to the financial crash of 2008. Yes, what we are now seeing is anti-democratic. Trump's rapid-fire series of executive orders, from the Muslim ban to financial deregulation, do undermine substantive democracy. But the presidency has long since been invested with war-making and surveillance powers hidden from public scrutiny and unchecked by debate or accountability. Trump inherits a form of government already well-equipped by his predecessors to undermine democracy. As is already apparent, the president and his billionaire mates and white supremacists will undoubtedly turn these tools to devastating effect. However, our critique of Trump and our determined political resistance to Trumpism, just as with our critique of fake news, shouldn't rest on venerating an ideal democracy, an ideal that we've never really achieved. So from my point of view, the task today is not to return the media to an imaginary pre-neoliberal bliss that may well turn out to be even less democratic than the forms of media we have now. I'm coming back to that slide that Sahel started with. Instead, we need first to challenge some of the most obvious abuses of media power. We need to oppose further concentration, to resist the stereotypes and distortions that seek to normalise things like racism and war. Second, we need to figure out how to build a radical political project in which truth-telling and communicative capacity emerge from the bottom up and not through paternalistic diktat or pure market exchange. I'm going to finish in a minute, that's my key to cue, stop talking. This will require not a clever media strategy, but the imagination to conceive of a democratic communications system as one that's genuinely in the hands of its users, as opposed to one that's controlled by billionaires and bureaucrats. The principle, as Raymond Williams wrote 50 years ago, should be that the active contributors have control of their own means of expression. The interactive and decentralised affordances of digital media ought to make that easier to achieve, but only if they're freed from the same structures of controlling state and profit-maximising market that have distorted and undermined previous communication revolutions. This will need new business models, a reimagined public service media. The BBC is not innocent in any of this by a long stretch of the imagination, and it will require new regulatory requirements. Wolfgang Streeck, in his book How Will Capitalism End, says that a rising share of goods that make today's capitalist economies grow would not sell if people dreamed other dreams than they do, which makes understanding, developing and controlling their dreams a fundamental concern of political economy in advanced capitalist society. Liberal democracy has failed an awful lot of people, but it's very difficult to imagine anything other. The media are our dream machines, so it's vitally important that we're able to imagine them differently and then campaign to bring about their transformation. And that's where
the first one is the discussion is kind of very UK based.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if this is the picture you're presenting around media concentration and also the kind of symbiotic link between media concentration and the concentration of social media, essentially, in search. And if that's an international picture as well?
It is an international picture in that media concentration of ownership is largely increasing around the globe, and in some places it's far worse than we have it here, and in some places it's slightly better. Where it is slightly better, there tends to be regulation over media plurality. So there are limits on how much a single individual can own of that particular media landscape. And that's some of the things that we're trying to campaign for here. But if you go to places like Australia, Murdoch owns virtually everything. And if you go, you can go into very many other places around the world, and media concentration is generally increasing. And if you take the internet, let's just not say social media, but if we take the internet into that frame, then we've got to say that actually that increase in concentration of ownership is massively enhanced if you think the majority of people now access information through Google or Facebook. They are two single companies driven by massive commercial imperatives. So that actually globally the situation is changing such that not only do we have these two global corporations dominating much of the ways in which we receive certain public debates and can facilitate certain conversations, but they are also beginning to, if you take things like just the language that circulates online, the English language again is hugely dominant on the internet, Arabic is only 5% of internet content. So you begin to see how there's also a Western imperialist dominance that goes on through those platforms as well.
Okay, so I was last question, which might give an overview of what I thought the main claims were.
Yeah.
So like clarify if those were in fact the main claims, and then sort of try and take it up from there. So I understood you to be presenting like there are two aspects to kind of changing power structures, media power structures. One is this increasing concentration of media ownership, and the other, that's also tied in with media chasing advertising revenue, which is in decline because it's migrating online. So digital advertising spend is like 90%, 80%. Now with Google and Facebook alone, never mind anything else. So the media is not just being concentrated in terms of who owns it, but the kind of media it is changing as well. Because in order to kind of get advertising, it needs to send out what we call fast and shallow. Is that the word? Yeah, fast and shallow journalism, clickbait journalism, essentially. So there's a way in which, despite the struggle for income and revenues between traditional media and online, kind of online engines, in fact they operate according to the same media logic. That's a communication mechanism, that they all want clickbait and stuff that will be processed very quickly through Facebook and Google. So I can see the move that you're making in terms of politically repressing this is having to take place on two fronts at once. One is that media concentration needs to be broken up. So that's the kind of work you do through this. And apologies also for the hats off.
No,
the restricting hats off, so that was misled by Hugh Grant on the website. It did important work around just ordinary people who were under attack from media demands. So there's a kind of move which is to change policy, change the states, change legislation, act through government organisations and sort of inquests and the rest of it to kind of break up media ownership and have it more evenly distributed around with different actors. And then there's another move which is to change the amount of media that's being produced, which I think was your appeal at the end, for more people to be producing media at the same time. Both of those have to happen simultaneously. Partly to change the ownership issue, so other voices can come in, and that's part of the democratic moment. But also, other voices can come in terms of the kinds of stories that get reported, not just who owns it. So is that?
Yeah, no, that's pretty accurate. I think what needs to happen is, when Sahel began, he pointed to work that we were doing in the Centre for, in the League Media Research Centre. And that was a 5-year project that looked at the changing nature of news in the digital age. And what we found there from that research was, you have a very broken business model of, particularly with the press, where much of those papers were subsidised heavily by advertising, largely classified ads within those papers. That all migrated onto things like eBay, and the bottom fell out of that newspaper financial model. So what they've been doing ever since then is desperately trying to catch up and try and figure out a way of making some money in the digital age. One of the ways in which they've tried to survive is by slashing the numbers of journalists they employ and increasing the amount of cut and paste content that they use as a consequence. So a lot of the news we were tracing and tracking during that time was being recirculated either from straight out press releases or from other newspapers. And sadly, the Daily Mail was often a place where that was being used as a kind of touch base for recirculating all manner of content. So it might be slightly repurposed, but a lot of it would come from a single source. So you get a very kind of quick fix type journalism, with some journalists having to file something like, between 17 and up to 40 stories a day. And of course, the only way you can do that is cut and paste, lift it from somewhere else and put it into your own paper. So there's an economics that goes behind that. That's not a cuss on journalists, that is just the economics of the industry itself that have been chasing to catch up on themselves within the digital age. because a pound in print translates to a penny in digital advertising, money that you can recoup online, you've got to do an awful lot more of that in an online space in order to actually get any money back from it. And they're still figuring out how to do that. In order to change the media landscape, you have to work at, I think, multiple levels. So one of those is to say, you've got to break that link between that kind of link of power, where you've got very long-standing elites in a position of authority, which are that can actually hold power over politicians. And in the Leveson inquiry, this became very clear. And Prime Minister after Prime Minister, successive Prime Minister, said, we think that relationship has got too close in that inquiry. And what they were referring to is they were basically willing to follow a newspaper line, so a Murdoch line, in order to get favour by that newspaper, in order to then, in their mind, be more electable, or be seen as being more electable. So currying favour all the time with a lot of tabloid press. You could argue that didn't make any difference, but actually the very fact that they think it might have made a difference made them have a very particular relationship with that, with politicians. And that has gone, that's a long story that is still going on now. So one of the reasons why the recommendations of the Leveson inquiry have never been fully enacted is because those people currently in government don't want to piss off certain newspapers. And so they still hold an enormous amount of power. So despite the fact that you get regulation that is passed unanimously across the House of Commons in a cross-party consensus that is agreed by 80% of the population as being necessary, that doesn't happen because of the power those newspapers hold over that political process. So in order to break that, you have to break the concentration of ownership. So you have to give them less power, in a sense. And that means introducing some kind of legislation over limits on ownership. But you also need to ensure that those people writing the stories themselves can be held to account. So this is the work of Hacked Off, which was attempting to devise a system whereby ordinary people would have access to justice if their lives were roughshod over by journalists seeking a sensationalist story. Stories that are often just pure lies, actually, but they wreck other people's lives in the process. So unless you have a system whereby individuals can stand up and say, actually, you know what, you're not allowed to do that, and I'm going to take you to court, then that, you get into a position, again, where they can do what the hell they like in order to sell more copies of those papers. And again, we see that time and time again. Those two things aside will just help, enable a fairer and more accountable media system. But unless you have the grassroots, the new organisations coming up, those organisations that will also challenge the mainstream media, so you get a kind of much more activist, a much more diverse, a much more engaged media coming up from the grassroots that is led by people on the ground, that doesn't, isn't playing those same power games. Again, you're unlikely to get what could be constituted as a democratic media system. So our bid across both Hacked Off and Media Reform Coalition is that you need much more plurality of voices in that media landscape. And there are very many ways in which that can happen. There's some brilliant examples. There's the Bristol Cable in Bristol, which is a cooperative newspaper, incredibly successful, is in print and online. It does astonishing investigative journalism and brilliant local journalism, and costs members £2 a month to be part, to keep that newspaper functioning. So it has found a financial model that works for it. And there are other examples emerging.
Is there any questions? Just one, two. I'm going to ask one, just one. before those come out. Just to take up this last point, all my questions are all kind of despairing. Okay. Just to take up this last point about alternative voices or kind of grassroots, and I take that to be, I think you mentioned, is it Tambini, who says that we need news that challenges orthodox authority, and this point around the imagination to conceive media coming up from different levels. One of the reasons that I was interested in putting on this series was a response to the kind of fake news, post-truth, and around, it was very noticeable around the Trump campaign. You mentioned the Macedonian teenagers. It's there with Brexit, so on and so forth. That part of this expanded ecology is this kind of toxic 4chan, 8chan, Reddit culture, which does produce alternative news stories, although whether they're news or not doesn't really matter. It's news enough to kind of go through that clickbait distribution, sort of viral cycle. So it seems to me it's got to be more than just like we need new voices and new production of stories. There's got to be some checking of the kinds of things.
And that's where the systems of regulatory control of that news kicks in. So unless you have a system of news regulation where you can challenge misrepresentation, you can challenge distortion, you can say, actually, I think that is, illegal on grounds of incitement to racial hatred. Unless you have a regulatory system where you can actually make the news accountable in key ways, or things that claim to be the news accountable, then you kind of don't know where to go with that. Anything can claim to be the truth, and there is no genuine system of check. At the moment, we have an organisation called IPSO, which stands for the Independent Press Standards Organisation, which was set up by the biggest players in the press industry and is run by the press industry, largely. So it's not independent. It has not held a single investigation since it's been in place, despite many of the hugely Islamophobia complaints around Islamophobia that have been made to it. It hasn't really held any newspaper to check at all. So, you can say it's a poodle, it's not doing anything. The system that was set up through the new regulation that came out of the Leveson inquiry recognised another regulator called Impress that does fulfil all the requirements of Leveson, yet all the main newspapers refuse to sign up to it. I wonder why. So, this body exists, and it has in excess of 70 members now, all of whom are these smaller scale alternative, who, are saying, yeah, we're willing to be independently regulated. So you can go through Impress with a complaint, and you can do it on the basis of a free and open arbitration system, so your access to justice is guaranteed. So you don't have to have megabucks. If you're going to previously, if you're going to take a big newspaper to court, you had to be willing to put your entire livelihood on the line. IPSO have just announced themselves an arbitration system, but they are saying it's not compulsory. So a newspaper can, again, pick or choose which case it thinks it would like to put in to this very low-cost arbitration. Now that just stacks everything in the newspaper's favour. You have to have a system of regulation which ultimately can engender confidence in the public that what they're saying can be challenged and held to account. And that's the way you deal, I think, with some of those issues. And, if they're not part of these systems of regulation, an actual guaranteed independent regulator, I think you have to be very wary of what you're reading.
Is there anywhere in the world that provides a model for regulation affecting what appears online? Because you sort of seem to be
all
suggesting...
of this appears. This is for what's online as well. It's for a publisher. A publisher is not in print. A publisher is also a publisher online.
But if the issue is about regulating regulating stuff that appears as news not coming from mainstream media.
Yes, it doesn't cover that.
But I wonder if there are any models anywhere that kind of
No, and the only ones, of course, that are being proposed at the moment are those that are coming out of the likes of Google and Facebook, who are themselves saying we're going to find some way of policing this, so that we're, again, how they will be doing that partly algorithmically, and the difficulty with anything which evolves around algorithms is they're changing them by the minute in order. So it's very, very hard for them to be transparent about what their algorithms are because they're constantly shifting. And they're not going to shift the commercial imperative that is the real architecture behind those algorithms. So what will come out of that is yet to be seen.
Okay, I have some questions. There's one here and one here. Two.
So, to some extent, you touched on this with the Bristol paper. I was going to ask you, because the only other alternative is to go Google it, which papers or sources would you recommend that we use? Where do you go for your real news?
I go everywhere. I go everywhere. So it's a really good point, because actually you do get to a point where you think, I go everywhere, and I go everywhere with cynicism, I think. So it's a constant source of checks and balances across everything until you feel like you might be getting somewhere closer to something. Now, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because I think we should have a degree of cynicism when we're approaching anything, but there comes a point at which you want to know what's behind that, and that, when you're an academic researcher, I guess that's what you do. You try and go back to some of the original sources and see where that came from in the first place. So anything that you hear as breaking news on Twitter, never believe, and always, figure out, do a bit of a journalistic job yourself and see where that came from, and try and go back to that original source, because often it has, there's been a very slippery slope to where it ends up as being breaking news. But I think that's one of the good things about the internet, that you can do that. You can, but it takes time, right? Very few people have that amount of time. So we rely in our lives in a very time-compressed existence, largely because of the digital, on somebody giving us something that might approximate the truth. And that's where the problem lies. So I think the BBC is really missing a trick here, because it could really genuinely be a trusted source of information if it wasn't so kind of oblivious to the fact that actually it's the very way in which it is structured is hugely elitist and totally anti-democratic. If it got that right, again, there would be, that would make a huge difference to our information ecology. They could really change the way people relate to the BBC online. We've seen its trust levels drop consistently year on year. But there are very real ways in which that could be reformed and made more democratic. And that's the direction we've got to push in constantly.
It's really interesting. Thank you so much. I had a question. Trump has had this kind of very strange relationship with the media, and he's kind of being rather aggressive towards the media as well. Kind of whimsical in the sense when he allows them within the White House or not, or the kind of interviews and different media reporters or newspapers. So what do you have to say on that?
I think he's actually been much cannier than we give him credit for. I think he knows exactly what he's doing when he is, because he knows that he times his tweets for exactly the moment at which a particular news agenda will take off or will feed through into the local news reports. There's a brilliant piece just out, actually, by Nancy Fraser, who you may know is a great American theorist, who, and I'm trying to remember where it is, but she goes through the ways in which Trump organises and times his own media interventions in order to ensure that he's getting as much media airtime and internet coverage as possible. So he's being very, very canny. He knows precisely what he is doing in that process. And, you know, people tend to think, oh, he's just shouting his mouth off and he's being, but no, actually, he knows what he's doing. He's quite organised and orchestrated in that process. He's probably, you know, been cleverer around using social media than any other politician before him, really. But he will also fall a cropper as a consequence of that. The whimsical relationship to the mainstream media is an interesting one, because he is, you know, he will simply fall foul at any point. So that, the couple of the slides I showed there was when his big thing with CNN is being, you know, calling everyone fake news and CNN, but this is really very fake news. And he turns on things if they object to what he says, or if they don't quite present the truth in the forms that he says, then, and he knows that they're going to come out and do that. He knows that they're going to say that. But, you know, they don't have a lot of choice, and they just have to keep rehearsing those debates and those arguments. But partly, that again means it just keeps circulating online. The way the algorithms work with the mainstream media and the internet is they prioritise what they think of as being important stories, and they grade importance by the amount of hits it's getting, so the amount it's being shared online. Of course, the amount it's being shared online is dominated by those mainstream media sites. So we know on Twitter, for example, that 10% of people tweeting account for about 90% of content. That 10% is dominated by mainstream media and celebrities. So that's, you know, you're getting that just, it's like a double count. You get it reinforced endlessly. He's simply working. That whimsical relationship is playing that system.
Hi there, thanks for your talk. I'm really interested in how different business models might work within this, because I think this is central to rethinking how to operate. And I wondered if you could say anything about the Bristol newspaper, but also I've been thinking about BuzzFeed as a particularly interesting model, who managed to still afford long-form journalism within a clickbait headline remit, which seems particularly interesting. And in comparison to somewhere like Vice, perhaps, which falls somewhat short, but also tries in similar ways.
Yeah, it's interesting because the Bristol Cable have opted completely away from clickbait journalism as a very deliberate choice, because they don't want to feel that they are trapped within that, you know, that desperate game in any way, shape or form. So they operate on a principle where you literally sign in as a member and you pay this very small amount of £2 a month, and they reckon they only needed, I might get this wrong, but it wasn't many, it was something like 4,000 members in order for them to be functioning. They're not, they're not aiming for megabucks. They're aiming to pay the people that work for them a living wage and to work with the locale. So they're not in it for an awful lot of money, although they're not frightened of earning money. They wouldn't call themselves a not-for-profit, for example. When you get into those organisations, and you know, you could include the likes of the Canary and things as well in the bracket of clickbait journalism, it becomes quite difficult, because you are then will fall prey to not necessarily the way you write it may be very different to the Daily Mail, but you are writing according to the types of issues they are also writing about. So you don't break out of that normative framework of what is news, because you're following the ticker of tape that goes across. In most newsrooms now, there is an endless count of which stories are getting the biggest hits. They'll say, oh, look, Fluffy Cat's getting this amount, we must do more Fluffy Cat, or you know, this story's picking up loads of hits, we must go with that. And what you do there is you get a situation where okay, nobody's ever going to write about alternative financial models. Nobody's really going to say there's an alternative to capitalism, or you just don't create the space by which those things can be created. So, BuzzFeed has its own kind of way of engaging audiences and allowing a little bit of long form that I think is interesting, but I think it's also limited, and they know it's limited in certain ways. So they've got to, ways in which you can really challenge on a daily basis what's coming out in the news needs to be really carefully thought through. And I think there's, one possibility of doing that is to actually make the likes of Google and Facebook pay some tax, and that a small percentage of that taxation could go into a public media fund that could underpin some, really interesting alternative news sites that go around and actually enable them to get off the ground and function without having to constantly chasing ad spend, which ultimately is very, very difficult to survive off. Really difficult. So you wonder how long those things can last with those models. And what you see over time is that they increasingly become more commercial in output.
Thank you. So this is in two parts, and the first follows on from the business model question, and is to do with The Guardian and how The Guardian is funded and structured, and with particular attention to its role during the last election, where it similarly failed to support Corbyn right up until about 5 days before the election, when it flipped, changed sides, if you like. And so it left us, Britain, in the position of not having a mass circulation newspaper which supported the Labour Party in the last election. Basically, all the parties supported not Labour. So that seems to be a fundamental question. So, even away from the Murdochs of this world, you've got this possible alternative that actually doesn't seem to function as an alternative. The second question resides around historically you've had organisations like communist parties in the 1930s having their own mass circulation newspapers which articulated the view from below, however distinctive that might have become over time. But the question is, why isn't it possible now, for example, with the Labour Party, which has one of the biggest mass-organised mass memberships in Western Europe of any political party, why isn't it able to generate either paper or an online newspaper which articulates that critical position in relation to the way neoliberalism functions? Why just can't we get that together? What's going on structurally to prevent that happening?
It's a very interesting question. I think starting with The Guardian, for those of you who don't know, The Guardian is supported by the Scott Trust. So it actually has a financial buffer zone in which there's a lot of money that comes through the Scott Trust that enables them to not chase commerce in quite the same way as some other newspapers. And I think its problem over the coverage of Corbyn largely comes out of the liberal elites that make up The Guardian. And that's a major issue. The Guardian know it's a major issue. That they are, you go into their newsroom, it is startlingly white, startlingly male, and horrifically middle class. I mean, it's just astonishing. And that they recognise that all the way through. So what you've got there is very, a lot of Labour, left-leaning journalists, but very centre party, right of centre party journalists who simply couldn't bear the thought that that's where their newspaper was going to go until it became blindingly obvious that they were missing a trick. So, and they had a couple of pro-Corbyn journalists and commentators on the paper who were able to work very hard at ensuring that happened. So, you know, yeah, it's a major problem that they're sort of aware of, but it's very hard to see how that will shift until they actually start employing different people. In terms of a party newspaper, I think the Labour Party would be likely to veer away from that on the basis that it would just be seen as a partisan press, which would, you know, okay, so every other tabloid press is a partisan press, but actually and sadly, in my view, the Labour Party see a lot of the answer as being in the digital. So their response to this, and it's in one sense it's a good response because they have decided there is no reason to court the mainstream media at all anymore because they simply misrepresent and distort them every step of the way. Now that's a good position to be in because you don't have to play that game anymore. And I think that puts them in a position of strength actually. However, the flip side to that is they think the way to get that communication out is online. Now that for me introduces some problems, and it's a problem because of the way the internet is used and accessed. So we know that in the UK, for example, something, you know, like 98% of people in general have access to the internet. However, when you look at people who are the poorest in society, so those that are earning £12,500 or less, that drops dramatically to something like 60%. That's a huge shift. So if you are, as a left-wing party, seeking to organise and share information amongst online only, you are missing a fundamental part of the population who would be, you know, actually likely to engage and change society in particular forms. So that's a real issue. There's also an issue with the ways in which people use the internet, so not just having access to it. We know from research that the way people use the internet is the same for everybody when it comes to entertainment and porn, apparently, or vice as they call it, we all do that apparently. But the single correlation, the only thing that is correlated in internet usage and social class is information and politics. So if you are of a higher educational achiever and from a particular social class, you will use the internet for information and politics. So again, we're kind of relying on a circulation of information that is disaggregated. And that's a problem when you come to actually dealing with and growing a left-wing politics.
Sorry, just can you take the mic? There's a question
Hi, what about the Mirror? That was
yes, the Mirror did support Corbyn.
But it's owned by Trinity Mirror, who own all the local press. And for me, the big problem is local press doesn't exist anymore. And that's also sort of echoed with the TV news media, which is regional. So I see it's a kind of divide and rule thing where you only get the news in the area that you're in. So therefore, and there should be, you know, a kind of national review of all the local news, perhaps once a week, so that we can see what's going on in other places, and often find different views and awful things, kind of the same way as consumer news works. Yeah, and so I think that would be a great step if we only had access to what's going on. And there was a programme on Radio 4 about local news, where one guy was, I don't know, writing for 3 different local papers, and he was based in London papers, and he was based in Dorset, doing all that news. And also recently from a personal point of view, there's stuff going on locally, and the only way to get the local reporter down is to send her a press release, and then it's written for her, and then she might make a couple of calls. But I remember her predecessor, a few years ago, would be at every planning meeting, recording all the decisions being made and writing about it the next day. And they also used to have a link with the police all the time, so the South London Press used to be full of deaths and murders. It used to be gruesome reading. Anyway, local press.
No, I think that's a crucial issue. And as you rightly say, the local press has suffered all sorts of problems, largely over mergers and consolidations. So when they have become less financially profitable, and often they still are profitable, but they got used to such huge profit margins of around the 30% mark, that when that drops, the likes of the Mirror Group turn around and go, oh, no, that's looking dodgy, we'd better merge them with that new... You end up with a regional newspaper, in effect, out on an industrial estate with no connections whatsoever to the locality that it's covering. And so, funnily enough, people stop buying it because it's not actually, doing what a newspaper is supposed to do for that locale. We now have a situation in the UK, and I can't remember the precise statistics because I'm rubbish at remembering numbers, but there are very many places around the UK that have no local newspaper at all. So if you look at local government authorities, very many of those papers, it's on the Media Reform Coalition website, don't have a local newspaper at all. Now, what people say is, oh, well, that's all right, because we've got these little local news websites that crop up. I did a research project on this a few years ago. They are often, literally, one man and his dog, writing about things that they're particularly interested in themselves, and have no broader sense, actually, of the news agenda. They're not, they're not paid to do that. They're not paid to hold power to account. So it's a very unsatisfactory situation. The local press are one of, it's one of the saddest things that's happened really in the UK, the demise of the local news. And that is precisely where I think the likes of Google and Facebook should be taking some responsibility, and some of that, some tax revenue should be got from them and channeled back to them. Instead, what they did is they set up what's called a Google News Initiative, where you could apply for some money to try and counter some of the negative consequences of their own intermediary news service. So essentially they harvest news from everywhere else without paying for it and then spread it around. And they say, well, yeah, we recognise maybe that's not quite just. So we'll set up this Google News Initiative. But, again, all that's doing is really feeding the big beasts and not producing news at the grassroots level. So I think you're absolutely right, it's a campaign that's ongoing.
I just want to say, because I've heard talks by Jimmy Wales and John Snow recently echoing your ideas about local news and talking about how important it is. But you talk about like taxing people like Facebook and Google, but don't we have this kind of existing media tax in terms of the TV licence fee with the BBC, and we already have the BBC, so would it be a good idea to have a priority of kind of reorganising the BBC? So you have that, because they were originally set up to be sort of local broadcasters, but as you say, it's kind of publishers now that we're in this kind of internet age. They could offer like local apprenticeships to local working class or minority groups that could then sort of come up through a geographical area and then contribute into a central news thing. So there's already a structure there within the BBC, and isn't it really important to reform that as well as the ownership side of things?
No, you're absolutely right, and actually that is happening. But of course it's happening in a way that is not doing the sorts of things you're saying. So they now have to provide a certain amount of that licence fee money goes back out to regions, and they're supposed to be working with local news organisations to enable better journalism in those locales. But the problem being that all they're really doing is our licence fee money is going back into the Mirror Group and back into, which is not what we need, actually. So one of the proposals that will be coming out in the new year from the Media Reform Coalition is to do exactly some of the things you're talking about. It's to properly democratise the BBC regions so that they are run by a much more diverse and representative group of people who are properly doing independent news production and not just seeking to follow the same news models and the same news agendas that are propping up the commercial outfits.
Okay, just one last question here. I've got one.
Yes.
I was wondering what advice would you give us to participate or take action? Shall I just yell? To give us to participate, take action, or support those who are demanding, possibly bringing news that isn't corrupted, as in us as non-journalists wanting to get that.
I think it would be great if everybody was involved in the campaigns around media reform. We have a Media Democracy Festival coming up on March the 17th that we'll be advertising pretty soon, which brings together all these ideas. There'll be many people from all of the alternative news providers there. There'll also be campaign organisations there who are themselves running pop-up actions and other forms of protest and mobilisation around stopping the big news corporations getting any bigger and more powerful, and then facilitating the growth of new, more plural voices. So there are loads of ways in which people can get involved and then start to recirculate and share that information with other people. On the Hacked Off, we have a supporters group of about 180,000 people, which sounds like a lot, but it's nothing, right, really? So all of those things have got to grow in their support of the general population and people's willingness to come out and do stuff for us. So I know people say it's not as important as education, it's not as important as health. Actually, it probably is. If we really want to transform society for progressive ends, then it probably is just as important.
All right. I think that's a good point to finish. Thanks, a great.